Hi, this is Mark Graban. Welcome to Lean Blog Audio. This is a blog post titled Fred Noe of Jim Beam, Leadership Lessons on Mistakes, Innovation, and Long-Term Thinking. This is a post from September 9th, 2025. You can find the blog post by looking for a link in the show notes or go to leanblog.org/audio 448. Over the years, I've had the opportunity to meet and listen to many leaders across industries, healthcare, manufacturing, tech, and more. But two of the most memorable leadership conversations I've experienced came not in a boardroom or a strategy session, but around bourbon, specifically with Fred Noe, the seventh generation master distiller at Jim Beam. The first time was during a quarterly tour at the Jim Beam Clermont, Kentucky campus. Fred and his son Freddie, the eighth generation master distiller, they hosted a small group for lunch, a distillery walkthrough, and what turned into a good old-fashioned storytelling sessions. No slides, no script, just Fred. Funny, sharp, reflective, sharing stories about bourbon, business, and the bumps along the way. The second time was more recent, at a meeting of a group called the Original Greater Cincinnati Bourbon Society. I'm a member. If you know me, I am really into bourbon. And it's a great group. So it was a packed house that night, but Fred made it feel personal. Again, he spoke candidly about mistakes, experiments, and learning from what doesn't go right the first time or even the third time. Fred's best known for making great bourbon, but what struck me most both times I've heard him talk was how naturally he spoke about leadership. He doesn't use terms like PDSA cycle or psychological safety or a Japanese word like Kaizen, even though they have Japanese owners in terms of the Suntory company who bought them. And there's interesting stories about the culture clash. That's a different blog post, literally from a different year. But Fred seems to live all of these principles every day, and so does his team. So this piece is all about what we can learn from that mindset, about how small batch thinking creates big scale success, about how legacy and learning go hand in hand, and why sometimes you start testing new product experiments with a new, smaller 4,000-gallon fermenter before you bet on trying it in an old 40,000-gallon fermenter. Small fermenters, bigger learning. Innovation can feel risky, especially in an industry where your product takes years to mature. If something goes wrong, you might not know until it's been aging in a barrel for years or even a decade. That's why Fred and his team have embraced a smarter way to learn, by starting small, quite literally, with the equipment they use. Fred said, "It's easier to make mistakes at 4,000 gallons than at 40,000. And this refers to, again, the fermenter sizes used at the Fred Noe Craft Distillery. This is a new facility that was built versus those at the large-scale main plant. He said, quote, "If something doesn't go good, you've only got so much tied up in it. But if it turns out good, then we'll move it up to the big plant." And you can see pictures in the blog post of what those smaller fermenters look like. And this is not just a lesson in distilling. I mean, most of us are never going to do that. It's a lesson in designing for learning, and that's something we can all do. In Lean, we talk about testing improvements on a small scale, a prototype, a simulation, a controlled pilot, a small test of change. Freddie's 4,000-gallon fermenters function in the same way. It's a learning lab, a place to test ideas, tweak recipes, and explore what if with lower stakes and faster feedback loops. And Freddie, this is actually built for him. It was named after his dad, Fred, but Freddie does a lot of the experimental distilling and blending and aging and some of those unique products. The brown rice experiment in revisiting ideas. One of Fred's favorite example is brown rice bourbon. It wasn't a one-and-done idea. It's something they've circled back to over the years. He said, quote, "We got some real good response on our brown rice. We've actually revisited it several times. Did the innovation back years ago, but the accountants, they don't like seeing too much money tied up for 13 years in a warehouse." And brown rice bourbon is, bourbon is typically, well, it's got to be more than 51% corn, but it's typically bourbon is typically corn, rye, and barley. Brown rice bourbon would have some percentage of brown rice, and it's still 51% corn. These grains are cooked, and there's a liquid and a beer that's then distilled. So using different grains produces different flavors. Long story short, maybe it's too late for that. But translation of what Fred said, this brown rice bourbon was promising, but the long-term inventory risk was real. So the team paused, reflected, and tried again with adjustments, and it's been released. Innovation isn't always a straight line path. As Fred shows, it often looks more like loops, rework, and long pauses followed by new insights. And that's okay, as long as we keep learning. Innovation built during constraint. Well, so this newer Fred Noe Distillery and its adjoining kitchen table restaurant were both built during the COVID-19 pandemic. While most visitor experiences were shut down, Fred's team used the moment to lay the foundations for the future. He said, quote, "No visitors were coming in. We restricted people on campus to keep employees safe, but we still got things done." And again, it wasn't just about keeping busy. It was about building capacity for smarter experiments. The smaller distillery with new equipment, labs, and those smaller fermenters now enables experimentation at a pace and scale that would have been impossible in their larger legacy systems. So my question, what about failed experiments? When I heard Fred speak at the distillery, I asked him directly, how do you handle experiments that don't work out? This is a big theme related to my podcast, My Favorite Mistake, and the book, The Mistakes That Make Us. Well, Fred smiled and didn't hesitate. He said, quote, "You kind of have a good idea, you hope, but if something doesn't go good, well, that's just how it goes." No panic, no defensiveness, no excuses. What I heard there was acceptance and reflection. And I think that answer reveals a powerful leadership trait. Fred doesn't see a failed experiment as a personal failure. He sees it as part of the process. That mindset's essential to creating psychological safety, where people aren't afraid to try and leaders don't punish honest mistakes. Freddie's blend that didn't work out. Fred also shared a story about his son, Freddie, who again represents the 8th generation of the distillers in the Beam family. Like his father and grandfather before him, his grandfather is Booker Noe, a famous name in the whiskey world. The Booker's bourbon is named after him, by the way. So Freddie's been encouraged to experiment, even if things don't pan out. One idea Freddie had was to blend 3 different whiskeys, corn whiskey, rye whiskey, and malt whiskey, in hopes of recreating one of the Jim Beam mash bills through blending rather than traditional distilling, of having all of those in a single mash bill. It didn't work. Fred explained with a chuckle, all 3 of those whiskeys have too much corn in them, so when you try to blend them together, it doesn't balance out the way you'd think. That was a dead end, but also a win, because Freddie learned something critical about process and balance that no textbook could have taught him. In lean terms, it was a plan, do, study, adjust moment, where, in other words, you try, you reflect on it, you learn, and you move on. And most importantly, Fred didn't frame it as a mistake to regret. He framed it as part of the journey. He wasn't mocking Freddie or making fun of him. It was just the reality of, you try something different and sometimes it doesn't work out. Legacy, humility, and letting the next generation try. Fred also spoke about the pressure of legacy. His father, Booker Noe, was a pioneer in the bourbon world, and even he told Fred not to assume the business would always be there. Fred said, back in the 70s, bourbon wasn't so cool. Everybody was drinking that clear stuff, meaning vodka. My dad said, don't bank on this thing being here, end of quote. Now, it's hard to imagine now with bourbon surging in popularity. There's been a bit of a downturn the last couple of years. But that mindset, humble, realistic, and grounded, is part of what's kept Jim Beam innovative. Fred didn't walk into the family business with certainty. He came in with curiosity. And he's passed that same approach on to Freddie, who's carrying the torch with his Little Book series of whiskeys and other experimental blends. It's not a handoff of perfection, it's a handoff of learning. Thinking in decades, not quarters. One of the most striking points Fred made when I heard him more recently here in 2025, it wasn't about tanks or grains or yeast strains. It was about time horizons. Fred explained how their parent company, Suntory, approaches the bourbon business with a long-term perspective. Quote, they're looking 10 years out, not just at this quarter. They'll say, if we make these investments today, how's that going to help us a decade from now? Fred admitted that coming from decades in the American business environment, this perspective surprised him. He was used to accountants pressing him with short-term questions, like, what are you going to do with all this whiskey sitting in warehouses for 13 years? And feeling that tension between craft and quarterly results. He said, at first I thought, wow, really? 10 years? Most companies are worried about next quarter's numbers, but they say, no, take your time. Think about the long haul. That impressed me. What also struck Fred is that the Suntory leaders he works with aren't spreadsheet people, as he called them. Like Fred, they are whiskey people. Many of them were born into the industry, just as Fred was, and they view it not just as a business, but as a calling and a legacy. That shared perspective builds trust across cultures and continents. When Fred talks about tradition and heritage, Suntory doesn't need convincing. They live it too. And this perspective all aligns beautifully with lean thinking. In the book, The Toyota Way, one of the core principles, the first principle actually is, base management decisions on a long-term philosophy, even at the expense of short-term financial goals. By thinking in decades rather than quarters, Suntory creates the space for real innovation to thrive. It allows Jim Beam to invest in a new craft distillery during a pandemic or to keep tinkering with brown rice bourbon recipes for years until they're ready to scale. It also gives Fred and his team the freedom to treat mistakes not as setbacks, but as stepping stones toward long-term success. And there are some related blog posts in this blog post. Again, you can go to leanblog.org/audio448. One article, the blog post is titled Why Kaizen is an Important Differentiator for Japanese Whiskey. And another one is about culture and Kaizen, the Kaizen and culture clash between Suntory and Jim Beam. So distilling the leadership lessons. What can we take from Fred's stories, whether we're leading a distillery, a hospital, a factory, or a startup? Here's a few, if you will, distilled lessons. Yes, that pun was absolutely intended. I know you don't care if it was intended, but there it was. Lesson 1, start small to learn big. Use pilot spaces, small batch tools, or right-sized fermenters before making large-scale changes. Don't punish failed experiments. Create a culture where trying, learning, and adjusting is valued more than getting it right the first time, every time. Leverage constraints as creative fuel. Innovation isn't just for blue sky days. It often starts in the toughest moments. Reconnect with your why. Fred's stories often come back to family, legacy, and love for the craft. Great leadership starts with clarity of purpose. Think in decades, not quarters. Real improvement requires patience, humility, and a willingness to invest for the long haul. Make space for the next generation. Leaders who truly care about improvement are always asking, who else can we involve? Who else can we teach? So here's a toast to mistakes that age well. Again, I guess pun intended. Fred Noe might be in the whiskey business, but he's also in the learning business. He keeps learning. The best of what Jim Beam produces isn't just aged in oak, it's aged in experience, in trial and error, in respect for what came before and what's possible next. We don't always know if a small 4,000-gallon idea will be worth scaling, but with the right mindset, team, and environment, we can learn our way there. And sometimes that learning is as smooth as a well-aged pour. So there are some other related posts about bourbon mistakes. Some of this is related to the My Favorite Mistake podcast. One is mistake stories from Garrison Brothers Distillery in Texas. Dan Garrison, the founder, and Donis Todd, their master distiller, have great stories to tell. And David Meyer, former Toyota guy and now owner and distiller at Glens Creek Distilling, shares stories. I think it's fascinating, even if you don't care about bourbon, how it's made or consuming it. So again, that's the blog post. You can go to leanblog.org/audio448 if you want to read it, to share it, to comment. Thanks for listening.